So what is cybersecurity? Well, this is a great definition from Dr. Haseeb here. And basically, I'll read it to you real quick. Cybersecurity is the mission-focused and risk-optimized management of information which maximizes confidentiality, integrity, and availability using a balanced mix of people, policy, and technology while perennially improving over time. So what does this all mean? Well, cybersecurity, think of it as a very holistic type of view of things that bake into an organization's mission. So what is a company trying to accomplish? What is it trying to do on a business operations standpoint? And what are some of the regulations, et cetera, and standards that the organization has to follow? And how can we wrap that up all into maximum confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which is the CIA Triad? Using these methods, which is basically process and technology. And again, keeping in mind that cybersecurity isn't, hey, now we have cybersecurity in the company. It's always evolving over time. There's always new threats. There's always new vulnerabilities. There's always new changes to the organization, right? One day you might be selling something like umbrellas, and the next minute you're selling something like masks, as we've seen during the pandemic. So there's a lot of changes over time. Cybersecurity is always evolving over time. So again, making sure that I can actually access the chart of the patient that I need, and then make sure that it's at the right time. Identity and access management. Basically, all this is making sure the right people can access the right systems, right? So going back to the example of me being a nurse for Susan, just making sure that when you put someone in, for example, a nursing group, like saying they're a nurse, that they're actually a nurse, right? And then lastly, for the CIA Triad, we have availability, which is just being that the right people can actually access the right data at the right time. So if we think of something like a DDoS attack, which we'll talk about later in the course, that's preventing people, or at least preventing them to some capacity from accessing the data that they should have access to, it becomes an issue of availability. So it's an attack on availability. So role-based access control, in that example of Susan, I would make sure that all the nurses have a certain level of access. The hope there is that there's been measures put in place, especially with training, etc., that I should know I shouldn't be doing that. Make sure that the right people have the right information, right? So we talked about the CIA Triad, but what is that exactly? We've got confidentiality, so we'll always want to keep the data safe. Only the right people can access that said data. For example, let's say I work as a nurse in a hospital, and Susan is a patient, right? But not my patient. HIPAA states that I shouldn't be actually looking at Susan's chart. I could get in trouble. I could actually get fired. Or possibly, depending on what I'm doing with that said data, I could be prosecuted for a criminal activity, as well as earn fines. Because I'm not supposed to be looking at that, right? Susan is not my patient. I shouldn't be looking at that. Now, however, if I am the nurse for Susan in that situation, then I should have access to it, right? So confidentiality is basically just making sure that the right people have the right access and nobody else can access that data. So when we talk about defensive depth and the aspect of security in a company, we're talking through things like our administrative controls, our physical controls, and our technical controls, right? So administrative, that's our policies and procedures, what you should be doing, right? Physical controls, things like making sure people scan in or having locked doors or locking certain areas, having things like man traps, etc. Technical controls, that's our more logical stuff, right? On our network, right? So making sure we're hardening devices using firewalls, SIMs, IDS, IPS, segmenting things, using containers, etc., etc. Single sign-on is an authentication method that enables users to securely authenticate with multiple applications and websites by using just one set of credentials. Integrity is just making sure that this is actually the right data. So for example, there was a game we used to play when I was younger in school in which the teacher would basically whisper something in one person's ear, and that person then would whisper it to somebody else, and so far on. Right, so you expect by the last person it would be the same message. So for example, if the teacher had said CIA Triad, it should be that the last message, or the last person receiving the message, heard and said CIA Triad. However, we know how kids can be silly and whatnot, so the teacher might have said, again, CIA Triad for the first person, and by the time it got to the last person, it's purple unicorns jumping off a bridge or something crazy like that. That was completely unrelated to what the teacher had originally said. So that's what we're talking about with integrity, right? We want to make sure that the data is actually in its correct form and it's the correct data. Make sure that it's not been compromised in any way or corrupted. And then, of course, there's availability, just being the right people can actually access the right data at the right time. So if we're thinking of things like DDoS attacks, which we'll talk about later in the course, That's preventing people, or at least preventing them from in some capacity from accessing the data that they should have access to, and so on. Data loss prevention is a cybersecurity methodology that combines technology and best practices to prevent the exposure of sensitive information outside of an organization, especially regulated data, such as personally identifiable information, and compliance-related data, such as HIPAA, SOX, and PCI. Privileged identity management gives users the ability to control, manage, and monitor the access privileges that people have to crucial resources within an organization. These may include important files, user accounts, documentation, and even application code and infrastructural elements such as databases and security systems. With PIM, you can manage all your privileged identities as well as your identity privileged accounts. Multi-factor authentication is a security technology that requires multiple methods of authentication from independent categories of credentials to verify a user's identity for a login or other transaction. Multi-factor authentication combines two or more independent credentials: what user knows, such as passwords, what the user has, such as a security token, and what the user is. So now let's go over some identity and access management tools. Role-based access control refers to an authorization strategy that organizes privileges based on a role. The role-based access control authorization strategy is commonly used by medium-sized to large organizations that need to categorize their personnel using role assignment. Roles are associated with access rights and permissions to use resources. Assigning a role to an individual user ensures that they have only those permissions required to perform their jobs. This is an important part in an overall cybersecurity strategy. These roles may reflect organizational structure and often also different departments. In other words, an employee is given in a department may be having assigned a system access rights based on the role required. Defense in depth. Think of this in the best light as your house, right? So if I have a house, I might have a fence around that house to keep burglars out. I may also have some dogs, right, to discourage the burglar from coming in. I may have a security system. I may have things like firearms, depending on where you live. I might have doors that lock, right? I should have doors that lock and windows that lock. I might even have bars on the windows to try and keep people from breaking in. Maybe I live in a gated neighborhood. So all these things are just things that we call defense in depth. It's just putting layers in place to prevent the bad people from coming to us and discourage them so they can go someplace else, right? So in our example, let's say we have a very nice big screen TV and we don't want anyone to steal it. So we put all these things in place: the wall, the dog, security system, maybe have a security guard. We have security cameras, bars on the windows, bars on the doors. We may have locks everywhere, and we maybe have firearms inside, etc., etc. We have all these things to pretty much mitigate the threat of somebody coming. So let's say if the adversary jumps our fence, then they'll get bit by the dog, right? And so maybe they get past the dog, but then at that point, they can't get into the windows. They can try the windows or the next door, but the security guard outside may tackle them. So you see how these different things are going to put mitigations in place to make it frustrating for them. So instead, they see the fence, and a lot of times they're just going to go to the neighbors or somewhere else, right, and then attack there. Especially if they hear the dog barking or they see a sign that says security cameras are on the premise. They're going to go off and go to the neighbors where none of that stuff is there. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at things like defense in depth.